Um, Afade. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Michael Leon Guerrero. Currently, my position actually is with a network of alliances called Unity, which includes 6 alliances of domestic workers, guest workers, day laborers, community-based organizations, and worker organizations throughout the country. As Ikaika mentioned, I used to work for the Grassroots Global Justice Alliance, which I'll go into a little bit more. I am Chamorro, as he also stated. My family is from the island of Guam. I'm part of the diaspora also, so I actually grew up primarily in California. I got a lot of my political development here at the University of California at Berkeley. Go Bears. And actually most of my organizing background is through community organizing. I did a lot of community organizing work primarily around environmental justice issues in the state of New Mexico with an organization called Southwest Organizing Project. And through that process also got involved in the environmental justice movement, and then later as things developed more into the global justice movement as well during the last decade. And that's where I got involved with the Grassroots Global Justice Alliance, which helped to connect community-based organizations in the United States with international social movements. We primarily did that through the World Social Forum process, but it was a way for us to actually, and I appreciate what Julian brought up on the last panel, the fact that we have to act globally, not just think locally, think globally and act locally, but we have to act globally as well. And that was a great experience in terms of learning how to engage at the international level and to network and build alliances at the international level as well. So I'm going to talk in my time from that framework, from that context. We've heard a lot, and I just, before I go on, just really acknowledge and appreciate the International Forum on Globalization for bringing this gathering together and for this teach-in. I'm sorry I couldn't be at the first one, but this has been a tremendous download for those of you who've had the opportunity to be here the last 2 days and to hear people from the front lines of communities throughout the Pacific region of the struggles that have been going on, and just the strength and resilience of communities, and just the knowledge and experience that we have. It's just really been a tremendous event. And each panel could have been an event in itself. And it's just unfortunate there couldn't have been more people here to actually benefit from it, because it's been a great experience. But anyway, so I'm going to just kind of, some of it's going to be recap of things that we've already heard. So, you know, just to summarize, there's a number of crises that we're facing, and my friend Steve Williams, who used to work at Power here in the Bay Area, talked about the 3 E's. The ecology, the crisis of the ecology, the crisis of the economy, and the crisis of empire. And we've touched on all of those different topics while we've been here over the weekend. I'm going to speak to a couple of them, but most of it actually from the movement side, and I'm not checking email or text, by the way. I'm actually looking at my notes here. But the you know, so just looking at the whole issue of the capitalism and crisis, the crisis of capitalism, for instance, and the responses by these machines, as Chris Schultz, I think it was yesterday, talked about the machines and the robots, and the corporate power, the extent of corporate power that we're facing today, and also the response of these corporations in terms of the crisis. In seeking more resources around the world, access to resources, access to cheap labor, creating trade regimes and global rules to allow for basically the sacking of our communities and the exploitation of labor. The decline of the U.S. empire is another issue that we've talked about. And you know, when back in the day, years ago, we used to talk about, or the U.S. military used to talk about being able to operate or act on 3 fronts globally. They're not doing that anymore. The U.S. military is finding itself stretched as the hegemony of the United States is beginning to decline. And so it was also brought up yesterday in terms of the David Vine talked about the lily pad strategy of the United States. And Walden Bello talked about this morning how the withdrawal or the consolidation of forces from the Middle East to the Pacific really in a lot of ways is a retreat because the United States doesn't have the capacity to maintain these fronts as it did before. And it's also been brought up that the emergence of progressive movements and governments in Latin America that was supported in large part because of the U.S. military being bogged down in the Middle East and preventing the United States from doing military interventions in Latin America as it did throughout the 80s. That's not to say that there haven't been other means that the U.S. has been trying to intervene in those countries, but it hasn't been open invasion to the extent that we've seen in the past. So these are just some of the dynamics. We're seeing capital, we're seeing the U.S. empire. The strategies that they're doing now, the pivot, is a prioritization. It's a prioritization of focus of economics resources in the search for markets, the search for resources, the consolidation of their hegemony in a more focused area. So 60% of these resources, military resources being moved to the area is not a surprise. And then also looking at the trade agreements like the TPP, it's important to remember that the TPP is just the latest manifestation of trade agreements. And in a lot of ways, it's been a response to the victories of social movements in the defeat of the Free Trade Area of the Americas, for instance, in 2005, in the defeat of the Multilateral Agreement on Investments, the stalling of the WTO negotiations. Rather than going for these big global trade agreements like the WTO and the GATT, the capital started to look at how can we do binational trade agreements. And that was a way to get around social movements and spread us out strategically so that they could win precedents and win basically gain their victories on isolated scales, and they could set precedent that they can build up to later. So, but the movements, the social movements have also been responding to this picture, and we've had a number of major victories, and we saw the emergence over the last 20 years of the global justice movement. And I would argue that it still exists today and just has different manifestations and also goes through its own struggles. So beginning with the North American Free Trade Agreement, we saw a tremendous mobilization of peoples throughout the Americas in response to that, and the emergence of the Zapatistas and the EZLN in Chiapas, for instance. But it also sparked the beginning of this movement, which IFG has been a part of also in many of our organizations, to fight these neoliberal trade agreements. And that led to the defeat of the MIA and then the battle in Seattle. We could say that Cochabamba and the water wars was also part of this struggle in terms of fighting globalization and the defeat of Bechtel. And then in February of 2003, we saw the largest mobilization ever in world history of peoples against the invasion of Afghanistan by the United States. So we saw this movement really take off on mass mobilizations that were taking place throughout the world and winning victories. And one of the major landmark victories happened in 2005 when the Free Trade Area of the Americas was defeated in Mar del Plata, Argentina, and Hugo Chavez basically declared it dead and buried there in Mar del Plata. But we also then started to see the emergence of Latin America as a political center. We started to see Venezuela and the changes in Venezuela and Brazil, governments that if they were not openly left in their politics, at least came in with an agenda of being anti-neoliberal. And so a new bloc, progressive bloc, developed in Latin America that was really buoyed by social movements that were bringing these governments to power. And it was also through this process of convergence that kept happening throughout the world, through the global justice movement, throughout Latin America, that strengthened the movements in being able to work across borders. So that was a very significant moment. Then we started to see a shift in more recent years in terms of how the global movement looked like. And the reason was because of the economic crisis. But then we started to see the Arab Spring. We started to see new movements emerge. The Yanamar in Senegal. We started to see the Indignados in Spain, Occupy here in the United States. Mass mobilizations again of people in response to the crisis in capitalism, to struggles for democracy, etc. And so we're seeing new faces, new movements that are starting to be a part of this process. And I think a lot of that got consolidated actually in Tunisia at the World Social Forum this past month, actually, we could see a lot of those movements starting to interact more and more in that sense. So why do I bring all of this up? I think it's important for us to understand that this struggle that we are embarked upon, that people have been talking about all this weekend, in some ways represents kind of a new phase of the global justice movement as well. It's important for us to realize, like I said earlier, that the TPP and the Pacific Pivot is not just about the Pacific, right? This is about a global strategy. And it's about how do we have, as movements, a global response that's rooted in our local struggles, but at the same time, we are networking, we're collaborating, we're communicating, and we are struggling together. So that's the challenge before us, and it's the thing that I wanted to offer today, is for us to think about the scaffolding that we need. What are the things that we'll need to be able to confront this new reality that faces us in the Pacific? You know, it's significant that we don't hear about the TPP as much in circles as we did it like NAFTA, which was just in the news all the time, or even the WTO and the battle in Seattle, when in fact the TPP is going to affect every sector and every aspect of our lives, just as these other trade agreements did. So it's important for us, in terms of having a national strategy in the United States, to incorporate and bring in other sectors into this fight. So obviously there's a labor element to this, and we need to reach out to folks in labor, students, faith communities, environmental organizations, on and on and on. Everybody could see a stake in this fight and should be involved in it in that way, and that's the way that we should be messaging it. It's not just about what happens in the Pacific region. This is about what happens to everybody and all of us, and how they're doing things like these secret tribunals that are undermining the democracy and sovereignty of nations and indigenous communities. In terms of the Pacific, we need to think about what are the mechanisms and what is the infrastructure that we need for us to be able to network. Obviously, we know it's very challenging because it's such a vast region, and because we're talking about islands and small islands that are very far apart, and it's very difficult for people to network. It's difficult for people to meet face to face. It's very expensive, as I'm sure the organizers of this conference will tell you, to be able to bring people together face to face to be able to network. But we need to think about how are we going to build and support the capacity on the ground for local fights that are going to intensify as the TPP moves forward, as the Pacific Pivot moves forward. How do we strengthen emergency response in hotspots that we're going to see, like West Papua New Guinea, and in Guam, places that we know are going to flare up, in Jeju, that are going to flare up in the next few years? How do we strengthen our emergency response to that and get the messages out about those things? How do we create the legal and political instruments, like the free prior consent and UN mandates and legal frameworks and legal precedents and law cases that are going to allow us to fight things on the legal front as well, on the political front? How are we going to strengthen communications? You know, both internal in terms of how we network, but also in terms of messaging and media and all of those kind of things. So it's a new challenge for us. It's a new day for us to figure out how do we build this infrastructure, this scaffolding for the next generation of struggle that we're about to face. This is nothing new. The networking and organizing has been going on throughout the Pacific since our ancestors. More than has been historically documented, more than even we know, our ancestors were communicating with each other and finding ways to meet each other and work together and collaborate. How do we do that now in this new era when the Pacific now, in a lot of ways, will become the focal point of geopolitics? Just as Latin America in the last decade for social movements became an epicenter politically, it's likely that it will be the Pacific next, or it could be Africa, or it could be both, and it could be them along with Latin America. And we need to be prepared for that as social movements and empower ourselves to be ready for those struggles. So anyway, there's the bell, and yeah, I think that's all I wanted to offer. As we enter into this next conversation, in the next section about ideas, that's the next step. So this has been an important step in terms of grounding ourselves and understanding the struggles and what we're up against. And the next step that we need to discuss then is how do we start to have the conversations about the struggles themselves and how we elevate those and make them stronger and strengthen our coordination. So with that, thank you very much.